Thank you for joining the Octavia Flynn Public Library for our Authors Festival. Our guest this afternoon is Daniel Vandever. You may know Daniel from his first children's book, Fall in Line Holden, released in 2017. Today, he is sharing with us visual storytelling in children's books, as well as a preview of his upcoming book, Herizon. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce Daniel Vandever.
I appreciate you having me here today, and I want to thank the library for inviting me back. This is my second time participating in the Authors Festival that the library has hosted, and I appreciate you extending the invitation out to talk about my previous book, but then also about the book I'm going to be releasing here within the next year, which is, as you had mentioned, titled Herizon. So, just thank you for the opportunity, and I'm really happy to be in this space, sharing this with everyone for the first time. So today I'm going to be talking about, in line with the theme of the festival, visual storytelling, and then specifically within children's books. And I'm going to use the two books that I've written so far to help illustrate this presentation, starting with Fall in Line Holden. Like you had mentioned, was released in 2017. And then my new book, which you see a visual of it here on the main screen, titled Herizon, which I hope to self-publish this year. So again, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for hosting such a cool event virtually. In introducing myself and really kind of introducing everybody to me, if you haven't heard of my book, or if this is your first time being introduced to the books that I write. As was mentioned, I had released my first book, Fall in Line Holden, in 2017, which I wrote and illustrated with Salina Bookshelf out of Flagstaff, Arizona. And I was fortunate with that book to be honored with the honor award with the American Indian Library Association. So I think by the time I was giving my first reading with the Octavia Flynn Public Library, I just got that sticker. And so that's something that's been an honor. I've been able to carry forth as a first-time author illustrator. And I was fortunate because the book received a lot of positive reviews from entities like School Libraries Journal, the Kirkus Reviews, but also a lot of bloggers and authors who've been instrumental in helping me carry forth my story, such as Debbie Reese, Cynthia Lydic Smith, just a whole big network of community that is behind children's literature. So I've been fortunate enough to have that story, which I'll be giving a reading here in a bit. But if you look over here in the bottom right hand corner, that all got started with an introduction I was given to an individual named Corey Begay out of Flagstaff. He was working with Salina at the time, and we were able to bring that book to life. So that's a big part of who I am. It's kind of weird having author behind your name, but because of this book, that's who I am. I always like to introduce where I'm from whenever I give these presentations, because I feel like it's a big part of who my identity is. So I know that we're coming to you remotely from Gallup, New Mexico, but I come from the community of Haystack, New Mexico. In Navajo, it's called Zitlachi, which means Red Mountain. So if you look at these little pictures to the right, if you're ever driving along Highway 40 between Gallup and Albuquerque, before you get to Grants, you'll see this mesa, red mesa right here in the background. But that's where I'm from. If you look at this map in the Four Corners areas of the Four Corners states, you see the dark orange, which outlines the Navajo Nation, and Haystack is the southeastmost corner of that nation. So if you could look on the screen, it's right here at the edge of the N, and that's where I come from. That's where my grandfather's land is, and his family's land has been, and it's where I like to call home. In addition to where I'm from, I think it's fitting to also introduce myself in Navajo. because I think that really paints a good picture of who I am, but also establishes relations with other people who might be tuning in. So Irish and Slay, Kia Ani Bushes Chin, Irish Dasha Che, Aro Tachini Dashanella, Akot Ego Denenshle. That's how I'm a Navajo person. And through, the Navajo clan system, your identity always comes through your mom first. So you see at the very top, I'm Irish. If you look at the picture off to the side, you'll see a younger version of me with big old chubby cheeks with my mom. And, I'm very fortunate to have her as a mom because she really helped instill an appreciation for education and knowledge in me at a young age. And, at the same time, she was really resilient and strong and everything you'd want in somebody who is looking after you. And, at a young age, she started a daycare in order to look after her kids and also overlook our education as well and getting that started. And so I always admire her, and I attribute really everything I am and everything I do to that. But that's from my first clan, which is Irish, from my mom. My second clan is Kia Ani, which comes from my dad by way of his mom, which you see to the right. And that's Kia Ani, or the Towering House clan. And so you see my grandmother off to the right. Her name was Bessie Desiderio Vandever. And, I think Kia Anis are really known for being strong leaders, but also educators as well. So I think a big part of who I am and where that comes from is through my grandmother and also my dad. My maternal grandfather was also Irish. And then my paternal grandfather was Tachini, or Red Running Into the Water clan, which traditionally within the Navajos is, the warriors, red running into water. And you could see that within the picture of my grandfather. He was a Marine in his younger days. And so I feel like I have that warrior spirit or that warrior blood in me as well. So if I believe in something, I'll push it. And, that's who I am, and that's my makeup. And as I said, that's how I'm a Navajo individual. But family's played a big part in who I am. You see a picture of my grandfather, my grandmother, and then my brother in our family Hogan and Haystack. My grandfather was a medicine man. But, that was my upbringing coming up, and it was something that really influenced me as a person, but then also an author. And, I think the main person where it starts is my grandfather. Mentioned he was a Marine. He was actually a Navajo code talker. And so growing up, he always really stressed to me and all my cousins, the importance of education, of language, of words. He used to say that you can make somebody's day or break it by the words that come out of your mouth. So, you choose your words wisely, use them for good and all those things. And so, what better testament or message could that come from than somebody who used his language to help save thousands, if not millions, of lives during time of war. And so you see him right here in the left picture as a young man when he was first enrolled and when he got out, and then as an elder. That was my grandfather, but throughout his entire life, that's what he really stressed. And for me, what I took for that is, that value of language and words and being able to carry that forth. So this was, a really big influence on me. And so I think for me, if you really want to get to know people, you talk about, what you've done, where you work, where you're from, who your family is. But to really understand me, and I think to understand the books that I'm going to be introducing to you today, you have to look at me as a kid, which I was kind of that mischief making kid who would do things like cheat at bobbing for apples, or had that wild imagination where, you wear a costume one day out of the year for Halloween, but I would wear it months at a time. So you see in that picture to the right, me dressed as a Ninja Turtle with my hand dipping into the bucket, picking it up. And I know right now with COVID, this is something that's unimaginable, but this is something that actually happened back in the day where kids would dunk their head into a bucket full of apples and try to bite one out. and that was your prize, for bobbing for apples. But I was always one of those kids who had a wild imagination, loved, bouncing off of walls, sliding on the floor. If you look at the picture to the left, I just have to have patches on my sweatpants because they were always, getting holes in them. If you looked at my shoes, if you could see it at the bottom, I was turtle powered all the way out. He had two strap-ons. The top one said turtle, the bottom one said power. But that's the kind of kid I was. I was a kid with a wild imagination that would sometimes get in trouble. But it was my identity. And so I always like to show this, just because if you really wanted to get to know me as an author and to really understand the books that I write, especially when they pertain towards fostering imagination within kids and thinking outside the box or thinking differently, this is all you have to look towards, is me as a child. So in completing my introduction, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick reading of my first book, just so you're introduced to me and my style. And I know it's kind of falling out of line with the theme of this festival with having words in it, but I think that's my whole point, is sometimes you do have to fall out of line. So although I'm going to read this, pay attention to the visuals and how it reinforces the book's message, just because I think that's important when really getting the full scope of this book. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick reading of my first book. I do give out the disclaimer that this book isn't called Fall in Line Holden. As you can see, it's in quotations and kind of rising as if somebody's getting yelled at. So it's really called Fall in Line Holden, as if you're getting yelled at by a teacher. So this is my first book, Fall in Line Holden, written and illustrated by me, Daniel W. Vandever. It begins. Deep in the heart of indigenous nation stood a strict Western school of stern education, where everyone obeyed and did what they were told, and conformity ruled all to fit like a mold, until a boy fell out of line. As class ends and recess begins, we all fall in line. We pass through the halls with art-covered walls. We all fall in line. We march left and then right with no end in our sight. We all fall in line. Fall in line, Holden. See the animals popping out at him. We bypass the laughs of the custodial staff. We all fall in line. Fall in line, Holden. As you can see, instead of seeing joking janitors, he sees clowns, rodeo clowns. We move slowly in silence with no words of defiance. We all fall in line. We pass the school's gym as a battle begins. We all fall in line. Our tired minds lag and our heavy feet drag. We all fall in line. Fall in line, Holden. You see, instead of playing dodgeball, Holden sees some Spartans coming to life and actual battle coming. We pass the lunch crew to the smell of mutton stew. We all fall in line. Fall in line, Holden. You see, instead of saying cafeteria staff making mutton stew, they're witches brewing a brew. We do as we're told and don't dare to be bold. We all fall in line. In respectable fashion, we pass the lab's distractions. We all fall in line. And though our backs ache, our spirits never break. We all fall in line. Fall in line, Holden. As you see, the computer turned into astronauts. Our class rambles on to the band's rhythmic song. We all fall in line. Fall in line, Holden. So he's lagging behind again, and instead of seeing music notes, kids singing in single file, they're jamming out, and you see birds flying around. With the playground in sight and just a glimmer of light, we all fall in line. But as we reach the door, we can't take it anymore. And we all fall out of line. And so you see that the kids finally made it to recess, and everybody that was in Holden's imagination greeted them outside the boarding school's walls. And they're getting to interact with what Holden got to interact with for the entire journey. And so with this book, I was really speaking to the creative imagination, that little kid like myself who, was growing up fighting Shredder and ninjas as a mutant ninja turtle. I think that really helped foster a lot of the creativity of myself today. A lot of that shaped my path to becoming an author and telling these types of stories and fostering environments or space where kids who might fall out of line and get labeled as a troublemaker could find safe space in being who they are, even if they might get yelled at every now and then. I think that's the beauty of the message of this book, is that as long as you have that creativity or imagination within you, that's what's unique about you and what should be celebrated. So that was my first book, Fall in Line, Holden. And as you can see, it really had a theme. One of my intentions of writing the book was to speak to a period of education, which really sought to conform Navajos and indigenous people throughout the world, really, and use the opportunity to speak about this period and what its impact has been on learning or on our current situation here on Navajo Nation, because you see things like high poverty rates or unemployment rates, and you wonder where that is. And I feel like, this is a direct line towards what that was. And for those of you who don't know, boarding school, it has a lot of connotations to different people. But for Native Americans, Navajos, indigenous people, it was a period of assimilation. And you can look at some of the pictures at the bottom of this slide to really, try to grasp what that meant. I think that theme that everyone points to, and kind of what the mantra was of this time, was to kill the Indian and save the man. And so you see some pictures of the early boarding school days, off-reservation boarding school that happened in Pennsylvania, Carlisle, Haskell, different boarding schools that really sought to westernize Native Americans and indigenous people, and really, get rid of things like language and culture, and, blend them into this melting pot of America. And, it was really militant. In that bottom right-hand corner, you could see the kids lined up in single file line, smallest to biggest. And, they really ran it like the military. So if you listen to the words, hopefully you picked up the cadence of a march, as if they're marching through the hallways. We march right, then we march left and then right with no end in our sight. We all fall in line. And so, I think oftentimes when people talk about this period, they think of it as, long ago, something that happened way before our time. But just as recently as my father's generation went through this, the top picture was provided by Leonard Perry from the Crown Point chapter, but this was from boarding school in the Crown Point area. And, just as recently as my dad's generation, tactics such as, cutting kids' hairs to be conformed, to get rid of the long hair, was a practice. Punishment for speaking language was a practice. If you look at these pictures, you'll see that some of the girls, I think if you look at this girl in the front row right here, They used to talk about cutting hair for females. They would cut it across and then around, down and around. Um, joke around that it looks like a mushroom head. That was the haircut that females got. My dad used to talk about getting his entire head shaved, except for his bangs. So if he got in trouble, then he'd get yanked by it. Don't do that, Obi. And you think about that and what it did to identity and self-worth and everything above. And I think you really get to understand the situation in which we are today. You talk about some of the social problems that come as a result of unemployment or poverty, or being stripped or attempted to be stripped of your culture and language. And this is the result. So within the book, when I was asking everyone to not only listen to the words, but pay attention to the graphics, and everything I put into that book had purpose or meaning. And I think when you talk about boarding school and those stories, even stories of like my dad running away at the age of 10, I believe him and a few of his cousins ran away from Fort Wingate boarding school, which is just outside of Gallup, 45 plus miles back to Haystack, where we're from, across rugged terrain, and you think about why that is. And I think, that's something that it's really tough to put into a children's books, because how do you talk about such harsh things? And so my strategy in writing this book was not only to have that within the language, within the cadence, within the uniformity of how it was structured, but also, in the use of lines. How do you guide people through it as they march through the corridors? How do you show that single filedness and uniform? That's where color comes into place. So if you notice throughout the entire book, all of Holden's classmates were muted out, whereas he was the only one with the blue t-shirt, until they were getting to the end of the story. Then they fell out of line, and then the color came to them. And then once they were outside of the boarding school, did they come to life, much like Holden was for the entire journey. So, color was a big thing. I really wanted to use it as a tool to also get inside of Holden's imagination. So if you notice, when they're walking through the hallways, it's really bland and, just that black and white tone. But whenever he was getting yelled at because he fell behind and was looking in the classrooms, that's where the colors got to pop. So, use of color was also a big thing to show, the drabness of being in boarding school, the conformity, but that imagination was his escape. And then things like white space. How do you guide, the students through school? You saw the diagonals. You saw even in these images where they're muted out, you don't see a face, because when you're like everybody else, you kind of lose that identity. So visually, I really wanted it to complement this theme, just because I wanted you to feel it, or at least the reader, from every angle, through the words, through the tone, through the images, and feel something from that. So that was a big part of Holden. I think visually, it's played a contribution to really resonate what I was trying to get across, which is to fall out of this conformity which was put on us. Which leads me into my second book, which is titled Herizon. And so I think the very first thing that I need to explain about it is that it is wordless. So as where with my first book, I was kind of falling out of line and throwing in words. This is a book driven completely without words, just by the illustrations and the visuals, which, when we were talking about the theme to this conference, falls right in to the mold of what that needs to be. So I'm going to go ahead and give a reading of this. But, I think it's important that when you're dealing with the book with no words, it's important to pay attention to the little things, and how is the story driven. If you're not going to have words that tell people what's happening, how are they going to get that? And so throughout this book, I'm going to get into it a little bit, but pay attention towards how the use of characters or the setting or the conflict, which is represented through transitions, is done. I think the best way to look at this, and maybe how we could start thinking about it before we even begin, is to look at this cover. So looking at the cover, which I think is very important within picture books, It's really kind of setting the tone of what the story is going to be about. So how would you break this down? I'm sure you guys are all probably doing it right now in your head, but just to kind of give some guidance, how do you look at it? For me, it starts with the title, Herizon. It's really a play off of the words of the horizon, or some distant place where Mother Earth meets Father Sky, that point. But it also carries meanings of, something that's possibly obtainable. It's on your horizon. So it's not only speaking to distance and setting, but also something that could be obtained. You also see that it's spelled wrong. Instead of horizon, Horizon. I did a little play on words with Herizon. So you could probably also start to pull that this is a story about a female heroine who drives the story. And so within the cover, you also see a little girl within the basket of a hot air balloon that makes up the O. So, this is how, you look at a cover or a book without words and make meaning of it. So pay close attention to things like that. Things like the hot air balloon, I'm not sure. I really like this to be interactive. So if there's a way we could do chats, but what does this make you think of? What does this elicit? I'm not sure if that's possible. And, but, for me, this is a design or a pattern that I grew up with my grandmother, always wearing, the Masona scarf, which is a patterned floral scarf, which my grandmother would use to tie up her hair. And whenever she was outside, it would provide shading, but also, as a form of fashion, kept her cool. She was able to ball up all of her quarters whenever she wanted Navajo 10 and then use it as a little purse. So this design had a lot of different meanings or functions. And it represents things like traditional clothes. I had somebody tap in, and yeah, that's a good thing to hone in on. If you look at it as a grandmother's traditional clothing, maybe within this story, there's some meaning within that as well. So breaking down that cover, you get some idea into the title, the image, but then also there's one more thing that really pops up. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, you see some people herding sheep. So potentially this story is also a story about, about sheep, raising it, which I know has a lot of relevance within Dene culture. And so you see a sheep down here. So by looking at it in this way, I want us to be able to look at this story and analyze it in that way. That's how you're supposed to look at these worthless books. And that's what drives the narrative of the story. So before we get into it, I do want to mention that, there are going to be some cues within this story. And as I mentioned, the things that really drive this story, especially with no words, is the various elements of a story, what makes that up. And it's characters, its setting, and then it's the conflict, which I represent within transitions. So as we read this book, I'm going to take some time, and as we're going through it, ask yourself these questions as we reach these different symbols to help better understand the story, but also the growth of the main character. And I did include some questions to maybe go through as you come to these pages. For instance, if you see this blue circled C, that's speaking to the character, and ask yourself, what is the character thinking? How does the character feel? Maybe even relate it to yourself. Can you describe a time you felt like this? I think one of the main reasons I wanted to get into a wordless picture book is, thinking about those kids who are often overlooked in the classroom. How do you engage them within the book? You could ask questions about how you relate to it, or these are ways of engaging students without right or wrong questions. And so keep that in mind. When you see this yellow circle with an S, it's indicating setting. Ask yourself, where does the scene take place? What does it tell you about the characters? Then why is it important? And then when you see this last one, the circle with the T, Here we're talking about the transition. And I want you to think about what is happening in the sequence. How does it represent growth? And then maybe even predicting what's going to happen next. I think those are the types of things when you see these to keep them in mind. So I know with the wordless book, you don't want somebody speaking at you. So I'm going to just drive it on my end. I'll take some time for you to take everything in. But keep that in your back of your mind when analyzing the story in regards to characters, settings, and transitions, and how that drives the narrative, while also really illuminating the growth of the main characters. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my next book, which is titled Herizon, written by Daniel W. Vandever. Even though it contains no words, and the only words it does have is spelled incorrectly with the title, illustrated by Corey Begay. One last thing I do want to say before I begin is that this book is meant to be in print. So you're reading with somebody. And so I'm going to be showing single pages of the book, but there are going to be certain spots that were designed to be seen as a spread or a full layout. So just keep that in mind as well. So without further ado, Herizon. Now this is the first page, and I know I'm not supposed to be talking, but this is your first cue again, where we're talking about the setting. Where does the scene take place? What does it tell you about the characters? And why is it important? I think if you're analyzing this page right off the bat, you see the grandmother with the binoculars on the porch, looking at something in the distance. But if you move down towards the page, you see that a girl is doing maybe dishes inside. Could see from the outside of the house that they got some peeled stucco or adobe with the little chicken wire showing. So perhaps when you're breaking this down, where does this take place? You could see that maybe they come from an impoverished community. And then you also see the little puppies below guarding the house, but you're automatically drawn back towards the main image, which is the grandmother setting the stage for the story. So she's looking at something in the distance. So again, apologies. Here we go. Now here we come to a pause again because you see the sea. So if we reflect back on those questions again, and this being an important part, speaking to the character. So what do you think the character is thinking in this scene? What does the character feel? And can you describe a time you felt like this? Leave that open into the chat. We have somebody saying it's a start of a journey. So if you noticed, you have the story beginning with the grandmother looking into a distance, and what she saw was two of her grandsons sleeping underneath the cedar tree, letting her sheep wander. So she ended up knocking and bringing it to the attention of her daughter to come, or her granddaughter to come, who dries her hands with the dish rag, comes and looks through the binoculars, and instead of seeing her lazy cousins falling asleep underneath the tree, she sees coyotes on the horizon looking in at the sheep. And so at this point, some of the feedback we're getting, you see fear from the girl, but also strength from the grandmother. See somebody saying that she's compelled to be a hero potentially. So really understanding this moment in time where she's now leaving the kitchen where she's doing dishes and looks like she's being called upon by her grandmother to help out in one way or another. So again, I'll be quiet as I proceed on. And here we're stopped again with another symbol. It's the circle with the T in purple representing transition. So here you see the girl now having the grandmother transition her scarf onto her, ties it up, and she's now leaving, starting her journey. So the question you'd be asking yourself from this image is, what is happening in the sequence? How does it represent growth? And what do you think will happen next? We had somebody comment that the grandmother is giving the girl a token of safety. So that powerful image we were talking about, maybe it's a tool to keep her safe. We had another comment of somebody saying it feels like you're taking flight. Which it looks like she's doing in this picture. She's in Monument Valley with the scarf now serving as a, what are they called? Hang glider or a cape almost. This is another page that's a spread. So you see it from her landing as she was coming in, taking flight, leaving the porch. That scarf then transitions into being a saddle blanket as she lands on a wild stallion, which you saw on the previous page. But again, you see the transition symbol. What is happening in this transition or the sequence? How does it represent growth? And then what do you think will happen next? Can you guys answer in the text or the chat box? How do you think this represents growth? Or what do you think will happen next? We had somebody say this is the actions that takes dreams to reality. We had somebody else say that there are ups and downs. So all good input. You see on the next page, come to our next setting as she gets bucked off of her horse, experiencing those ups and downs. She ends up landing in the river below. And you see her here with the circle S for, again, the setting. And if you recall, where does the scene take place? What does it tell you about the character? And then why is it important? So in the chat box, why do you think this scene is important for this little girl who had just gotten bucked off her horse and transitioned her scarf from a saddle blanket to a little cape, and then eventually a little Tom Sawyer Huckleberry Finn tent on a raft? We had somebody comment that she is on the raft and is safe once again. That must have been posted right before I turned this page, because now you see, peril is coming. We see another cue for transitions. And again, when we're looking at transitions, what is happening in the sequence? How does it represent growth? And what do you think will happen next? I'm getting some comments within Facebook. There's some comments about the girl being a survivor and responsibilities, as well as transformation, as you're growing. So if you're thinking about this sequence, what does this indicate about the little girl as opposed to when she first started her journey and got bucked off of the horse? And so I said I was going to be giving a preview. That's where I'm going to stop the story, was on that last slide as she's making her descent on towards where the story started, which her grandmother had seen her cousins being all lazy underneath the cedar tree with threat of an encroaching coyote coming after the herd of sheep. So I hate to do that to you, just because, I think this is a good story, and, I think the ending really ties it all together. But I think for the purpose of this conference or this festival, and figuring out how you use visuals to carry forth the story, I think that's where we'll leave it. But just know that this is a story that I hope to release within the next month or so. I'm self-publishing this book, but in looking at these images, I hope you're able to see how characters, settings, and transitions were able to really drive this narrative, especially when there were no words. And I think the chat really spoke to it, because a lot of people were able to pick up on themes that were happening, assuming responsibilities. The grandmother passing along a scarf to keep her granddaughter safe, and you look at that and you figure out how the story is driven from there. You look at the character, how were we introduced to the girl? She was indoors doing dishes. And, I was raised, over summers being a sheep herder with all my cousins. And a lot of my female cousins had to stay home at times and had to clean and do the dishes. And, I know a lot of them hated it because they'd rather be out herding sheep. But, that's one of the norms that I think as females, they have to endure, which is something that's been placed on them. But I think to break out of that, you saw that in the character, and you saw her growth or transformation as she made her way out, starting with giving up the dish rag for the scarf. That scene when her grandmother first showed her through the binoculars what she needed assistance with. But also looking into the things like setting. If you didn't notice, some of the scenes that took place were in Monument Valley. What do you think about when you see Monument Valley? For me, you think of John Wayne and the old Western movies, and it being kind of wild and rugged. So when you saw the wild horses that she landed on, it spoke to that character, that being of essence of where she was traveling. After she got bucked off and got thrown into Little Colorado River, she found comfort in the water. And, that's a theme for a lot of indigenous people. Water is life. She was revived in that. She was able to recollect herself. Got to squeegee out her skirt and continuing on. And it seemed lonely. We had a comment about that. But I think within the environment, she found that comfort. She found that companionship, even to the point where, she was going to see chaos again coming towards Grand Falls, Arizona. I know it wasn't brown like Grand Falls, but it was her imagination that saw this big old waterfall. But she ended up finding and regaining her strength in Canyon de Chelly. The center picture, you see Spider Rock, and that had meaning. You talk about Spider Rock being the home of Spider Woman, who passed on of teachings of how to weave, but also, your roles and responsibilities. I think that setting also played into telling this story as well. So, hopefully we can go back, and once I release this story, we could go back and take a look at these things, because everything within it had purpose, from the transitions. If you notice, when she first got loose and she, took off the scarf, it was like the feeling of freedom, and I think we could all, everyone who went to college or kind of got out of the house, you get out of the home and you're ready to go off and be your own person, but sometimes you could be a little too wild and get bucked off like she did with the horse. But you saw her grow through each of these transformations, to the point where at the end, as she is making her descent, she kind of had a little bit more tact with it, did a little bit more calmly, and kind of had that confidence of coming in and getting ready to take on the coyotes and her cousin's laziness. So, looking at that story within this lens, I think helps drive the story and what's going to happen next. So I hope you're thinking about what's going to be happening next, but coming this summer, like I said, hopefully within the next month or two, I'm self-publishing this book, basically because I feel like to best tell it, everything that I had planned out has to be in place. There's reasonings why there's no words in it. Not only because it provides opportunities to engage people who might not be reading otherwise, but it allows people to tell their story, tell their narrative. Eventually I want to be able to use a discussion guide or a resource guide on our website, which comes up with activities for teachers. Read it through one time as a class. Now break into little groups with little Post-its, put words to it, make it in Navajo, make it in a different language, post that. So when you read it again, you're putting your own stories to the narrative. And so I'm doing that right now. I was kind of disappointed because my computer crashed and I lost everything not 3 weeks ago, but fortunately I was able to restore everything and put it together. But now that I have everything, I'm ready to get this going again. So hopefully within this next year or month, I'll get it going so it could be purchased. But I want to be able to use a website to carry it forth in its message, to develop things like discussion guides or teachers guides, but also talking about my process of self-publishing, talking about things like aggregators, or what are the benefits of those, or do you host your website on Shopify or Squarespace, all those types of things I want to document. So if anybody else wants to follow in this path as well, you have the voice to carry it forth. So, and then within that page, talk about things like the symbols, things that you might have missed. For instance, what did the scarf represent? I know within the comment section, somebody had mentioned that it was a safety net that the grandmother was passing on to the girl. I think that's right on cue. You got it right to the point. But what does this scarf represent? Even in today, it's kind of a fashion icon. You see a lot of people wear it as masks, as a source of protection. So it's relevant. Looking at butterflies, if you notice when the girl was first making her flight, she entered into the story surrounded by butterflies, which can be seen as graceful. But even if you look into the origin stories of the Navajo, we started in the black world or the insect world. So I wanted to bring culture into that as well, and to being able to talk about how that had meaning within the story. It wasn't just she was feeling graceful and wanted to fly with butterflies. It's a paying respect to the stories of emergence. Or when she landed on the horses, they had specific color and intent within this. 4 sacred colors of the Navajo: white, blue, yellow, and black had meaning. If you notice, she landed on the white horse, which is representative of the East, or Nitzakes thinking. So that had relevance as well. So within this website, I'm going to explain into detail what each of these meant. Even things like the sheep, and what do you think that represented? For me, it was, the traditional life ways of the Navajo. So on this journey, the girl is on this mission to not only help her grandmother get her sheep, but also preserve and protect our traditional way of life. And so that's Herizon. I think one of the other things I'm going to be showing on the website is that this is a fictional book, yes, and it's story, but it's based off of real individuals. And so the grandma you saw within the story comes from my grandmother, who I introduced at the beginning, Bessie D. Vandever. One of my memories always was that my grandmother was always on the front porch looking for her cows. So she always had her binoculars looking on, and so that served as inspiration. My grandmother was a weaver. You see her weaving in the picture right here in the center. But if you know weaving, it's an intimate process. It's intergenerational. It's having a herd of sheep that the grandkids go off and, get fat and plump, but then also as they grow the wool, shear and card it, spin it, and then it's used as a way for my grandmother to make income. But it also preserves traditional life ways of living with the land, using traditional dyes, using sheep as a source of food with mutton. But my grandmother was a big inspiration for this story. And I think at the heart of this book's theme, is that intergenerational strength or knowledge that brings the empowerment. I wrote this book in dedication to my grandmother, but also for my nieces in moving forward. Hopefully carrying a lot of the teachings and everything that my grandmother exemplified, especially as the wife of a Navajo code talker. You had to be strong. You had to be able to deal with the things that came back with my grandfather from overseas. And my grandmother was that. She ended up having 9 kids, has countless grandkids. Unfortunately, my grandmother and grandfather had passed away last year or prior to COVID. But I'm hoping with this book to instill a sense of pride and empowerment in my nieces to carry forth the strength of my grandmother. So in writing this book, that's my hope, and I think, I'm talking about Herizon as something that's distant, but it's really now. You look at what's happening across the country, and I think there's no greater story or message that needs to be reinforced today, especially as we have things happening like Deb Haaland be named to the cabinet, the first Native American to do so. If you look at her, she's doing her swearing in, what kind of mask was she wearing? She had that floral design, that sense of empowerment. You look at us now being and having the first female vice president and a first lady, like Dr. Jill Biden, who values education. That's Herizon. Michaela Goad, who had gotten the Caldecott as the first Indigenous illustrator, that happened this year. And then the countless grassroots efforts that are taking place that are empowering the future for my nieces and everyone, really building a society of inclusion from organizations like Native Women Lead. I included 2 of their founding members, Vanessa Roanhorse and AJ Galashi, in this, but that sense of pride and power to move forward. You look at locally, the Navajo Hopi relief group is entirely female. This is the sign of the times and what I'm hoping to capture with this Herizon, because I think the time is now to push it forth. As I mentioned, the Navajo are a matrilineal society, and I think if we're going to be making changes and empowering a more inclusive future, it starts with females. And so that was the message behind my book. So that's who I am. That's my story and how I really tried to relate visuals into telling it through children's books. I'm not sure if anybody has any questions. I know we're allocating some time with that. If not, I am on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Reach out to me. Here are my handles. But again, I appreciate you guys' time. And I'd appreciate your support moving forward, especially as I look to push this book out into the public on my own in this next year. So, Quita, yeah. Thank you for your time.
All right. We do have a couple questions that came through. The first question is, your first book you wrote and illustrated. This second work, Herizon, was a collaboration because you worked with an illustrator. Can you speak a little bit about that collaborative process on a wordless picture book, and how that kind of came to be?
Yeah. First one, I think both of them really were a collaboration just because I was so green on doing my first book. I started as a present for my nephew, and at a party is where I had met Corey. And he was just like, yeah, we're looking for children's books. We have poetry, we have adult novels, but what we're lacking is in children's books. And so since I was creating it for my nephew, I basically had everything laid out. It was almost ready to be given as a present. And I think that's what helped me get published in the first place, because, you know, writing a manuscript for children's books, you throw it down on a piece of paper. And, you know, for me, like I was saying within this presentation, the visuals had a big part of what that would be. And so if I just laid out a manuscript, a Word document with the words and how it flows, that might be missed. So in creating that myself, I think it really played beneficial towards getting it picked up. It just needed some alterations or some tweaks. For instance, I was mentioning the use of color. You know, I was able to have Selina, Corey, and the late LaFrenda Frank do some editing and get it into a position where it talked about character growth. It showed boarding school tones within it. And so that I kind of had a finished product, but then it just took little tweaks in it that Corey helped me with in getting it to that point. And so if you noticed, it was really between the two books. One looked like it was done by an amateur artist, and then the second one was really popping and coming to life. And so when I was doing my second book, I knew how it was going to flow, how I was going to incorporate visuals. I had it all laid out, but I couldn't bring it to life like somebody that had the talent of Corey could. So I really just kind of, because we had that previous experience working together, went to him and saying, hey, I have this idea. I'm not sure if people will take kindly to it because they might not get the benefits of a wordless book or even how it might flow. Can you put it down on paper for me so I could, you know, at least pitch it and shop it around and let people see what it's like? And so it started out as that, where I just contracted it out and I was like, hey man, can we do this? He's like, yeah, let's do it. And I paid him one time, you know, here's the illustrations. And then we'll see where it goes from there. And I just kind of left it up to him. I was like, I'm purchasing these. Somebody might pick it up. Somebody might not. They might want an entire new illustrator. But we want to at least use this to kind of hook somebody in and see if they'd be interested in it. And I think it did. I think it did draw some interest, and I did get an offer from a publisher and was close to getting an offer from one of the major publishers in children's books. But the control thing on my end was a big deal. When I had pitched it to one of the bigger publishers, I think the mindset was we got to be able to, you know, brand and broadcast this to people who might not be familiar with the Southwest or understand how sheep come into the play of this narrative. So maybe we need words. And I was so strong against that and wanting it to be wordless. One, because it helps with the narrative of those who might feel voiceless. You know, I had alluded to the kids in the classroom and wanting to speak to them. So if I were to put words into it, it completely changes the intention behind this book. And it wouldn't allow me to speak to things like MMIW, murdered and missing Indigenous women, and their voice being taken away. And so really it was a decision on me for complete control and telling the story the way I wanted. Whereas like, hey, Corey, let's just keep this the way it is and, you know, see what we could do on our own self-publishing it. So I paid him that one time. I did a lot of the layouts. I'm not sure. I can show you some of the original drawings that were kind of showing that transition, because it was a process. Starting with my scribbles and my scratch, which was once you see the final product, you're going to be like, oh man, now I could see why you did it, because who would have picked up your story? You know, what were you drawing? So I'll share a screen really quick if I'm able to. Here was the first drawing done by me of the girl getting bucked off the horse. And as you can see, there's no way near you could probably even tell what's going on. But I'm not an illustrator. I did my first book digitally. So I was able to create shapes and then create the book in that way. But then you look at this is what I gave Corey. And you could kind of tell what's going on. There's the horse. It looks like it's stopping really quick. Is that her hair or is her hair? She's holding on to the little thing, but I gave him that. And from there, he's the artist. And then so he was able to produce a sketch of it, which came out like this. And within my notes, I kind of laid it out. This is where she's falling. This is where she's going to be riding the horse. And then this is where she gets bucked off. This is what he was able to create. And then he digitized it. So I think that was the whole main reason behind it, because if you look at this image compared to the last one, nobody's going to be purchasing or reading the book that I created. But if I were able to have him bring it to life, and I think mainly just the experience working with him in the past, knowing that he worked for a publisher and knows what it takes and what people are going to be looking towards is what kind of brought us back together. So for sure, that was the process in getting it going. And you see why, hopefully you see why I made that decision, because Corey's a really, really nice artist and brings a lot of imagination to it. So I'm not sure if that answers it, but.
Absolutely, yes. I have a few, not so much questions, but just comments from the Facebook. A few people really liked the aerial view. One lady comments that her grandmother never rode in an airplane until she was about 75 years old, and it gives a unique experience of the Navajo way of life, seeing the sheep from that aerial view. So that was a good comment that I enjoyed. Let's see, there's also a lot of people really enjoyed the scarf and how the scarf follows the girl through that story. So a lot of good comments there. Not so many other questions. If anyone in the Zoom has a question, feel free to type it in the chat. And you kind of touched on this, but this book was always intended to be wordless, or did you kind of have any thoughts of putting words to this work at any point? It seems like it was intended to be wordless, but I just want to clarify.
Yeah, it was intended to be wordless from the start. Just for that, I think oftentimes in history, females' voice has been silenced. And, you talk about a lot of the themes that are going on right now, the Me Too movement, equal pay in the workplace, all of these times, females have often been overlooked or neglected. And this isn't a future that I would like for my niece or my nieces or anybody. So I think part of that was to really amplify that. But also I think wordless books provide value to a lot of kids within the classroom. It allows for that creative space for them to roam and explore, this is what's happening. Or rather than you reading it in English, this time I'm going to read it in Navajo, or throw in little noises. My grandma used to get mad at me and would say like, hey, pick up your shoes or whatever. They could throw in those types of narratives and make it their own. So I know one of the things that I was really mindful of when writing this is that as a male, I also don't want to tell what this story is. I wanted to leave that space available for whoever experiences it and to fill in those blanks themselves, which I think is really important too. So I think that's kind of why I really wanted it to be wordless, and thinking of that space and allowing people the freedom to, get creative in their own right and put their own words to it, or their own experiences or perspectives. So yeah, from the start, that's how I wanted it.
That is absolutely beautiful. I think that's a great place for us to end. If you have questions for Daniel, he did post up his Facebook handles and those sorts of things. We'll also put them in the comments below. There will be an archived copy of this presentation on our YouTube channel if you'd like to check it out if you missed any part of it. Thank you to our guest, Daniel Vandever, and thank you for the preview of Herizon. The Octavia Flynn Public Library will be having live and recorded sessions for our Authors Festival for the rest of the month of May, so be sure to check us out on our website at ofpl.online for a full schedule of events, and we will see you guys next time.